And we're joined now by Mr. Khaled Dawoud, the Assistant Editor-in-Chief of Al-Ahram Weekly, to shed light on the realities and challenges that journalists encounter on the ground. Mr. Dawoud, thank you for joining us here on Q News. Now, this morning's tragic incident has added the rising toll on journalists in this conflict. Can you start by sharing your perspective on the dangers media workers face in the conflict zones, especially in Lebanon, on a daily basis?
Well, I think, first of all, thanks for having me. But I think that the suffering of the media workers have basically been going on since the beginning of the Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people in Gaza more than a year ago. And of course, the key target and aim is to hide the truth, hide the war crimes that are being committed by the Israeli occupation forces, first of all, over the past year in different parts of Gaza, and over the past month right now, in Lebanon, and the latest sad incident, of course, is the very determined targeting of headquarters, which media journalists are using in Lebanon to cover the ongoing war. But also, let me remind you, actually, that the first journalist victim of the Israeli aggression war more than a year ago was actually on the border between Israel and Lebanon, when the Israelis intentionally shelled a vehicle carrying a number of journalists, resulting in the death of a Reuters journalist. And all indications was that Israel committed this crime intentionally. So, I mean, it started in Lebanon, actually, and it kept on going on in Lebanon. But according to all in the media groups and all the NGOs that follow the violations of the Israeli army inside the occupied territories in Lebanon, they note very much that the number of journalists who died in this conflict is unprecedented compared to any other war, probably since World War II. I mean, over the past year, you have over 170 Palestinian journalists killed. And actually, what adds to the violations that the Israelis are committing, particularly in Gaza, that the Israeli occupation troops have not only been targeting journalists themselves, but also their family members, as we have seen early on in the war, against the families of journalists who work for Al Jazeera and other Palestinian media channels. Some of our fellow journalists have lost all their entire families. And of course, it's, I guess, one of the most difficult moments for any journalist in the world to be reporting on a certain incident and then later to discover that his family, his father, mother, or children have been killed themselves in the war. So probably what happened this morning or early this morning in Lebanon is a continuation of a consistent Israeli policy that's aimed at steering journalists away and not allowing them to cover the conflict, putting in mind, of course, that the Israeli occupation forces have prevented any international journalists from entering the occupied Gaza Strip since the beginning of this war. So on one hand, no foreign journalists are allowed into Gaza, and at the same time, nearly daily killings of the Palestinian journalists themselves working on the occupied territories.
Well, in light of Israel's recent attacks on the media-designated spaces and houses and safe and guest houses, now including the strikes in Hasbea, you've mentioned that it is an intentional strategy to silence or deter reporting in conflict areas. Now, is there a certain reason or a strategy that they are actually following? Are they targeting certain journalists or press personnel in specific?
Well, of course, the key purpose is that they want zero coverage coming out of the occupied Palestinian territories, considering the humongous amount of destruction and the horrific numbers of those who got killed in the Palestinian territories, both in Gaza, of course, that's the top number, nearly 40,000 people right now, and of course, and also in the West Bank, which wasn't spared this Israeli violence. So we have over 700 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank over the past year. So that's basically the main purpose, to hide the crimes that the Israelis are committing in the occupied territories, especially when it comes to certain channels that are known for their extensive coverage of the Palestinian cause, noting, of course, particularly the Jazeera channel that has been actually topped the list of the channels that lost members of their staff during the coverage of this war. And that's why, I mean, there's been this accusations by nearly all NGOs and all organizations covering media worldwide that the Israelis have been imposing the worst blockade journalists have ever seen in the history of coverage of wars. Even the only thing that's allowed actually is when the Israelis embed reporters based in Israel and take them along to the occupied Palestinian territories to check what the Israelis want them to see. But of course, that would be very biased coverage, and they never produce the objective and balanced coverage that the audience deserves to see.
Mr. Dawoud, now today really marks one of the deadliest days for journalists in a year of hostilities. Now, how does this continued violence against the press and media personnel impact the ability to document and report events accurately in conflict zones? I mean, and how are the media institutions and agencies trying to make up for the injured and those who lost their lives?
Well, I mean, again, the dependence is totally on the local staffers, the Palestinian local staffers who work inside Gaza, considering the bans and the restrictions that the Israelis have imposed on any other kinds of journalists working in the occupied territories. But of course, it's a very scary business. Our job as journalists is mainly to cover the events without getting our lives jeopardized. I mean, we're doing a professional job where they're not taking any side on those, kinds of daily conflicts that are taking place in Palestine. So, I mean, by law and according to international conventions, journalists should be provided with protection while carrying out their jobs. But on top of that, we have also seen the Israelis closing down the media offices of some media companies, such as Al Jazeera, and even it went to, at one point, even against international news agencies, who are now one of the key sources to provide at least pictures and information out of the occupied Palestinian territories. But again, we should all salute the resilience and the courage of the Palestinian reporters working inside Gaza and inside the West Bank for all the sacrifice that they've been offering for this job. And the fact that, I mean, I can never forget that whenever any journalists lose a member of their family or one of their colleagues, the first thing they say is that they will continue their mission despite all the difficulties, because they are the only eyes through which the world can see the atrocities which the Israelis are committed, and they're playing a very, very important role, at least in the future, for the documentation of those crimes and the fact that they could be presented later to the International Criminal Court, which Prosecutor General has issued arrest warrants against the Israeli Prime Minister and his Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant.
Mm-hmm. Well, journalists and press and media personnel join a long list of also other medical personnel and NGO workers, as you've mentioned. Do you believe that there are enough measures in place by international bodies to protect at least journalists, or is there more that should or could be done?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, the bitter experience of the past year proved that Israel doesn't bow to any pressure, because they've been committing all sorts of, unbelievable, unimaginable crimes, not just against journalists, but against health workers, rescue workers. I mean, people who work in the UN. Lately, even the engineers who are seeking to fix water facilities inside Gaza Strip. So again, unfortunately, the death of that huge number of journalists is part of the general suffering of the Palestinian people and the indifference of the world, despite all the big slogans that are being raised by Western democracies and including the United States and European nations that claim to champion freedom of expression worldwide. But when it comes to the Palestinian suffering, we see no real action. First of all, to provide protection to the Palestinian civilians who've been seeing a nightmare lately in the northern part of Gaza due to the siege and intentional starvation policy. So, Palestinians, journalists are part of the overall Palestinian people who are paying a heavy price, not just for the Israeli aggression, but for the world indifference and the hypocrisy of Western nations, topped with the United States, that provide Israel with all the weapons that are killing Palestinians and killing journalists.